The investigations. The vast majority of the City of London police files relating to their investigation into the Whitechapel murders were destroyed by German bombers during the London Blitz. The surviving Metropolitan Police files allow a detailed view of investigative procedures in the Victorian era. A large team of policemen conducted house-to-house inquiries throughout Whitechapel. Forensic material was collected and examined. Suspects were identified, traced, and either examined more closely or eliminated from the inquiry. Modern police work follows the same pattern. More than 2,000 people were interviewed, upwards of 300 people were investigated, and 80 people were detained. Following the murders of Stride and Eddowes, the Commissioner of the City Police, Sir James Fraser, offered a reward of £500 for the arrest of the Ripper. The investigation was initially conducted by the Metropolitan Police Whitechapel, H. Division Criminal Investigation Department, SID, headed by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed. After the murder of Nichols, Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews were sent from Central Office at Scotland Yard to assist. The City of London Police were involved under Detective Inspector James McWilliam after the Eddowes murder, which occurred within the City of London. The overall direction of the murder inquiries was hampered by the fact that the newly appointed head of the SID, Robert Anderson, was on leave in Switzerland between 7th of September and the 6th of October, during the time when Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes were killed. This prompted Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren to appoint Chief Inspector Donald Swanson to coordinate the inquiry from Scotland Yard. Butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, and physicians were suspected because of the manner of the mutilations. A surviving note from Major Henry Smith, Acting Commissioner of the City Police, indicates that the alibis of local butchers and slaughterers were investigated, with the result that they were eliminated from the inquiry. A report from Inspector Swanson to the Home Office confirms that 76 butchers and slaughterers were visited, and that the inquiry encompassed all their employees for the previous 6 months. Some contemporary figures, including Queen Victoria, thought the pattern of the murders indicated that the culprit was a butcher or cattle drover on one of the cattle boats that plied between London and mainland Europe. Whitechapel is close to the London docks, and usually such boats docked on Thursday or Friday and departed on Saturday or Sunday. The cattle boats were examined, but the dates of the murders did not coincide with a single boat's movements, and the transfer of a crewman between boats was also ruled out. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. In September of 1888, a group of volunteer citizens in London's East End formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. They patrolled the streets looking for suspicious characters, partly because of dissatisfaction with the failure of police to apprehend the perpetrator, and also because some members were concerned that the murders were affecting businesses in the area. The committee petitioned the government to raise a reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer, offered their own reward of £50 for any information leading to his capture, and hired private detectives to question witnesses independently. Criminal profiling. At the end of October, Robert Anderson asked Police Surgeon Thomas Bond to give his opinion on the extent of the murderer's surgical skill and knowledge. The opinion offered by Bond on the character of the Whitechapel murderer is the earliest surviving offender profile. Bond's assessment was based on his own examination of the most extensively mutilated victim and the post-mortem notes from the 4 previous canonical murders. He wrote, quote, All 5 murders no doubt were committed by the same hand. In the first 4 the throats appear to have been cut from left to right. In the last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it is impossible to say in what direction the fatal cut was made, but arterial blood was found on the wall in splashes close to where the woman's head must have been lying. All the circumstances surrounding the murders lead me to form the opinion that the women must have been lying down when murdered, and in every case the throat was first cut." End quote. Bond was strongly opposed to the idea that the murderer possessed any kind of scientific or anatomical knowledge, or even quote the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. End quote. In his opinion, the killer must have been a man of solitary habits, subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, with the character of the mutilations possibly indicating satyriasis. Bond also stated that the homicidal impulse may have developed from a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, or that religious mania may have been the original disease, but I do not think either hypothesis is likely. There is no evidence the perpetrator engaged in sexual activity with any of the victims, yet psychologists suppose that the penetration of the victims with a knife and leaving them on display in sexually degrading positions with the wounds exposed indicates that the perpetrator derived sexual pleasure from the attacks. This view is challenged by others, who dismiss such hypotheses as insupportable supposition. In addition to the contradictions and unreliability of contemporary accounts, attempts to identify the murderer are hampered by the lack of any surviving forensic evidence. DNA analysis on extant letters is inconclusive because the available material has been handled many times and is too contaminated to provide meaningful results. There have been mutually incompatible claims that DNA evidence points conclusively to 2 different suspects, and the methodology of both has also been criticized. The Ripper letters. Over the course of the Whitechapel murders, the police, newspapers, and other individuals received hundreds of letters regarding the case. Some letters were well-intentioned offers of advice as to how to catch the killer, but the vast majority were either hoaxes or generally useless. Hundreds of letters claimed to have been written by the killer himself, and 3 of these in particular are prominent: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. The Dear Boss letter, dated 25th of September and postmarked 27th of September 1888, was received that day by the Central News Agency, and was forwarded to Scotland Yard on the 29th of September. Initially, it was considered a hoax, but when Eddowes was found 3 days after the letter's postmark with a section of one ear obliquely cut from her body, the promise of the author to clip the lady's ears off gained attention. Eddowes' ear appears to have been nicked by the killer incidentally during his attack, and the letter writer's threat to send the ears to the police was never carried out. The name Jack the Ripper was first used in this letter by the signatory and gained worldwide notoriety after its publication. Most of the letters that followed copied this letter's tone. Some sources claim that another letter dated 17th of September 1888 was the first to use the name Jack the Ripper, but most experts believe that this was a fake inserted into police records in the 20th century. The Saucy Jackie postcard was postmarked 1st of October 1888 and was received the same day by the Central News Agency. The handwriting was similar to the Dear Boss letter, and mentioned the canonical murders committed on 30th of September, which the author refers to by writing double event this time. It has been argued that the postcard was posted before the murders were publicized, making it unlikely that a crank would hold such knowledge of the crime. However, It was postmarked more than 24 hours after the killings occurred, long after details of the murders were known and publicized by journalists, and had become general community gossip by the residents of Whitechapel. The From Hell letter was received by George Lusk, leader of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, on 16th of October 1888. The handwriting and style is unlike that of the Dear Boss letter and Saucy Jackie postcard. The letter came with a small box in which Lusk discovered half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits of wine, ethanol. Edaz's left kidney had been removed by the killer. The writer claimed that he fried and ate the missing kidney half. There is disagreement over the kidney. Some contend that it belonged to Edaz, while others argue that it was a macabre practical joke. The kidney was examined by Dr. Thomas Openshaw of the London Hospital, who determined that it was human and from the left side, but, contrary to false newspaper reports, he could not determine any other biological characteristics. Openshaw subsequently also received a letter signed Jack the Ripper. Scotland Yard published facsimiles of the Dear Boss letter and the postcard on 3st of October, in the ultimately vain hope that a member of the public would recognise the handwriting. Charles Warren explained in a letter to Godfrey Lushington, Permanent Under Secretary of State for the Home Department, "I think the whole thing is a hoax, but of course we are bound to try and ascertain the writer in any case." On 7th of October 1888, George R. Sims in the Sunday newspaper Referee, implied scathingly that the letter was written by a journalist to hurl the circulation of a newspaper sky high. Police officials later claimed to have identified a specific journalist as the author of both the Dear Boss letter and the postcard. The journalist was identified as Tom Bullen in a letter from Chief Inspector John Littlechild to George Sims dated 23 September 1913. A journalist named Fred Best reportedly confessed in 1931 that he and a colleague at the Star had written the letters signed Jack the Ripper to heighten interest in the murders and keep the business alive. The role of the media. The Ripper murders mark an important watershed in the treatment of crime by journalists. Jack the Ripper was not the first serial killer, but his case was the first to create a worldwide media frenzy. The Elementary Education Act of 1880 made school attendance compulsory regardless of class. As such, by 1888, more working-class people in England and Wales were literate. Tax reforms in the 1850s had enabled the publication of inexpensive newspapers with a wider circulation. These mushroomed in the later Victorian era to include mass circulation newspapers costing as little as a halfpenny, along with popular magazines such as the Illustrated Police News, which made the Ripper the beneficiary of previously unparalleled publicity. Consequently, at the height of the investigation, over 1 million copies of newspapers with extensive coverage devoted to the Whitechapel murders were sold each day. However, many of the articles were sensationalistic and speculative, and false information was regularly printed as fact. In addition, several articles speculating as to the identity of the Ripper alluded to local xenophobic rumors that the perpetrator was either Jewish or foreign. In early September, 6 days after the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, the Manchester Guardian reported, "Whatever information may be in the possession of the police, they deem it necessary to keep secret." It is believed their attention is particularly directed to a notorious character known as Letheraperon. Journalists were frustrated by the unwillingness of the CID to reveal details of their investigation to the public, and so resorted to writing reports of questionable veracity. Imaginative descriptions of Lether appeared in the press, but rival journalists dismissed these as a mythical outgrowth of the reporter's fancy. John Pizer, a local Jew who made footwear from leather, was known by the name Leather Apron and was arrested, even though the investigating inspector reported that at present there is no evidence whatsoever against him. He was soon released after the confirmation of his alibis. After the publication of the Dear Boss letter, Jack the Ripper supplanted Leather Apron as the name adopted by the press and public to describe the killer. The name Jack was already used to describe another fabled London attacker, Spring-Heeled Jack, who supposedly leapt over walls to strike at his victims and escape as quickly as he came. The invention and adoption of a nickname for a particular killer became standard media practice, with examples such as the Axeman of New Orleans, the Boston Strangler, and the Beltway Sniper. Examples derived from Jack the Ripper include the French Ripper, the de One-Quarters Seldorf Ripper, the Camden Ripper, the Blackout Ripper, Jack the Stripper, the Yorkshire Ripper, and the Rostov Ripper. Sensational press reports combined with the fact that no one was ever convicted of the murders have confused scholarly analysis and created a legend that casts a shadow over later serial killers. Jack the Ripper suspects. The concentration of the killings around weekends and public holidays and within a short distance of each other has indicated to many that the Ripper was in regular employment and lived locally. Others have thought that the killer was an educated upper-class man, possibly a doctor or an aristocrat who ventured into Whitechapel from a more well-to-do area. Such theories draw on cultural perceptions such as fear of the medical profession, mistrust of modern science, or the exploitation of the poor by the rich. Suspects proposed years after the murders include virtually anyone remotely connected to the case by contemporary documents, as well as many famous names who were never ever considered in the police investigation, including an artist, a physician, and a member of the British royal family, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Everyone alive at the time is now long dead, and modern authors are free to accuse anyone without any need for any supporting historical evidence. Suspects named in contemporary police documents include 3 in Sir Melville Macnaghten's 1894 memorandum, but the evidence against these individuals is, at best, circumstantial. There are many, varied theories about the identity and profession of Jack the Ripper, but authorities are not agreed upon any of them, and the number of named suspects reaches over 100. Despite continued interest in the case, the Ripper's identity remains unknown. The term Ripperology was coined to describe the study and analysis of the Ripper cases, and the murders have inspired numerous works of fiction. There are, however, 2 persons that were strong suspects at the time, and have now been named the real Jack the Ripper after new investigations in recent years. Has Jack the Ripper been identified? Aaron Kosminski, born Aaron Maud Kosminski, 11th of September 1865 to 24th of March 1919, was a Polish Jew who was admitted to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. Kosminski, without a form name, was named as a suspect by Sir Melville Macnaghten in his 1894 memorandum and by former Chief Inspector Donald Swanson in handwritten comments in the margin of his copy of Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson's memoirs. Anderson wrote that a Polish Jew had been identified as the Ripper, but that no prosecution was possible because the witness was also Jewish and refused to testify against a fellow Jew. Some authors are skeptical of this, while others use it in their theories. In his memorandum, Macnaghten stated that no one was ever identified as the Ripper, which directly contradicts Anderson's recollection. In 1987, author Martin Fido searched asylum records for any inmates called Kosminski, and found only one, Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski lived in Whitechapel. However, he was largely harmless in the asylum. His insanity took the form of auditory hallucinations, a paranoid fear of being fed by other people, a refusal to wash or bathe, and self-abuse. In his book The Cases That Haunt Us, former FBI profiler, John Douglas states that a paranoid individual such as Kosminski would likely have openly boasted of the murders while incarcerated had he been the killer, but there is no record that he ever did so. However, in 2014, DNA analysis tenuously linked Kosminski with a shawl said to have belonged to victim Catherine Eddowes, but experts including Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, the inventor of genetic fingerprinting, dismissed the claims as unreliable. In March 2019, the Journal of Forensic Sciences published a study that claimed DNA from Kosminski and Catherine Eddowes was found on the shawl, though other scientists have cast doubt on the study. The other candidate to be the Ripper is Jacob Levy. Jacob Levy, 1856 to the 29th of July 1891, was born in Aldgate in 1856. He followed in his father's trade as a butcher, and by 1888 he was living in Middlesex Street with his wife and children, which was right in the heart of Ripper territory, and close to where Catherine Eddowes was murdered. Levy contracted syphilis from a prostitute, making revenge a probable motive, and he was a butcher with the necessary skills to remove certain organs from the victims. The 2009 video game Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper uses a combination of historically attested and embellished evidence to propose his candidacy. The mystery of Jack the Ripper's identity continues. The legacy of Jack the Ripper. The nature of the Ripper murders and the impoverished lifestyle of the victims drew attention to the poor living conditions in the East End of London and galvanised public opinion against the overcrowded, insanitary slums. In the 2 decades after the murders, the worst of the slums were cleared and demolished, but the streets and some buildings survive, and the legend of the Ripper is still promoted by various guided tours of the murder sites and other locations pertaining to the case. For many years, the 10 Bells public house in Commercial Street, which had been frequented by at least one of the canonical Ripper victims, was the focus of such tours. In the immediate aftermath of the murders and later, Jack the Ripper became the children's bogeyman. Depictions were often phantasmic or monstrous. In the 1920s and 1930s, he was depicted in film dressed in everyday clothes as a man with a hidden secret, preying on his unsuspecting victims. Atmosphere and evil were suggested through lighting effects and shadow play. By the 1960s, the Ripper had become the symbol of a predatory aristocracy, and was more often portrayed in a top hat dressed as a gentleman. The establishment as a whole became the villain, with the Ripper acting as a manifestation of upper-class exploitation. The image of the Ripper merged with or borrowed symbols from horror stories, such as Dracula's cloak or Victor Frankenstein's organ harvest. The fictional world of the Ripper confused with multiple genres, ranging from Sherlock Holmes to Japanese erotic horror. Jack the Ripper features in hundreds of works of fiction and works which straddle the boundaries between fact and fiction, including the Ripper Letters and a hoax diary, the Diary of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper appears in novels, short stories, poems, comic books, games, songs, plays, operas, television programs, and films. More than 100 non-fiction works deal exclusively with the Jack the Ripper murders, making this case one of the most written about in the true crime genre. The term Ripperology was coined by Colin Wilson in the 1970s to describe the study of the case by professionals and amateurs. The periodicals Ripperana, Ripperologist, and Ripper Notes publish their research. In 2006, a BBC History magazine poll selected Jack the Ripper as the worst Briton in history. In 2015, the Jack the Ripper Museum opened in East London. It attracted criticism from both Tower Hamlets Mayor John Biggs and protesters. Similar protests occurred in 2021 when the second of two Jack the Chipper fish and chip shops opened in Greenwich, with some patrons threatening to boycott the premises. There is no waxwork figure of Jack the Ripper at Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors, unlike numerous murderers of lesser fame, in accordance with their policy of not modeling persons whose likeness is unknown. He is instead depicted as a shadow. Thank you for listening to our audiobook. Please leave a comment with your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe to receive notifications of new audiobooks.